There are places in Britain where history feels heavy. Not old, just heavy. Places where the air presses against your chest like something unseen is standing inches away from you. Where footsteps echo behind you long after the corridor is emptied. Where visitors emerge laughing nervously, only to fall strangely silent once they reach the daylight. Deep beneath the chalk hills of Buckinghamshire lies one of those places, a labyrinth of hand-cut tunnels, 1/4 of a mile beneath the earth. Twisting passageways lined with darkness so complete that your brain starts inventing shapes simply to survive it. This place is known as the Hellfire Caves. And for centuries, stories have clung to those tunnels like damp mould. Rituals, secret societies, black masses, disappearances, shadow figures. Visitors hearing their names whispered underground. Some say the caves are haunted by the souls of those who corrupted within them. Others believe something far older was disturbed when the tunnels were carved into the hillside. Tonight, we descend into the darkness, into the hidden world of the Hellfire Club, into the terrifying legends of Sir Francis Dashwood, and into the accounts from people who walked those tunnels and convinced they weren't alone. Welcome to your local haunt. Now firstly, to understand the Hellfire Caves you need to first understand the landscape around them. West Wycombe is the kind of English village that feels painted into existence. It's got old brick cottages, rolling hills, narrow lanes. Church bells drift across the valley. On the surface, it feels peaceful. But looming above the village sits West Wycombe Hill, and perched on top of that hill is St. Lawrence's Church. If you've ever seen photographs of the area, you'll know the church immediately. Not because of the building itself, but because of the enormous golden ball sitting on top of its tower. A giant sphere glittering over the countryside like an eye. People have speculated about its meaning for centuries. Some believe it symbolised vanity. Others say it was a private joke. But many locals whispered darker ideas, that the hill itself was a place of strange energy. Rituals that took place there long before Christianity arrived, and beneath that hill, hidden in the chalk, lay the caves. The entrance itself feels unnerving. Visitors describe an immediate temperature drop. The silence changes. And even before stepping inside, there's a sensation that the world above has already begun slipping away. You descend slowly. Stone walls close around you. Light weakens. And the tunnels begin. Long corridors stretch into dark. Passages named after rivers of the underworld. The River Styx. The River Lethe. Every inch designed intentionally, because these caves were never simply tunnels. They were theatre. Psychological theatre. A descent into darkness crafted by a man obsessed with symbolism, secrecy, and excess. And that man was Sir Francis Dashwood. And if the stories are true, he may have opened a door he never understood. Sir Francis Dashwood was born in 1708. He was rich, influential, and educated. The sort of man history usually paints in polished colours. But Dashwood was not interested in respectability. He was fascinated by indulgence, travel, occult imagery, and religious satire. He toured Europe extensively during his younger years, encountering secret societies, underground clubs, and whispered stories about ancient rites. And then when he returned to England, he brought those fascinations home with him. Eventually, he founded what would become the infamous Hellfire Club. Officially, the club had several names. The Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wycombe, the Monks of Medmenham, but the public gave it the name that endured, the Hellfire Club. Even now, that name carries weight. It sounds theatrical, almost fictional. But behind the rumours were real people. Politicians, writers and aristocrats. Powerful men gathering in secret. And secrecy breeds imagination. Especially when those meetings involved masked rituals, drunken ceremonies, sexual excess, and mock religious performances. The story spread quickly. Black magic, devil worship, and sacrifice. But these details changed depending on who told them. But one thing remained consistent. Everyone believed something deeply wrong had happened underground. In the 1740s and 50s, Dashwood ordered the excavation of the caves. Hundreds of labourers carved through chalk by hand. Some historians believe the chalk removed from the hills was used elsewhere in local construction. But the layout of the caves suggests something more deliberate. Symbolism appears everywhere. The journey through the tunnels mirrors a descent into the underworld. As visitors travel deeper underground, they pass through increasingly elaborate chambers. Torchlit halls, banqueting rooms, statues and altars, until eventually reaching the inner temple. It was the deepest chamber. It was the heart of the caves. A place many visitors still describe as oppressive, even today, especially today, because centuries of fear have stained those walls, and fear leaves fingerprints. Now, nobody knows exactly what happened inside the Hellfire Caves. The uncertainty is part of the terror. The club operated behind closed doors. Many records disappeared. Accounts conflict wildly. Some historians argue the Hellfire Club was little more than wealthy men mocking religion while drinking themselves unconscious. Others believe genuine occult practices took place. And there are stories from servants, workers, and villagers. Stories that persisted long after the club collapsed. Stories of women brought into the caves wearing masks, or cloaked figures chanting by candlelight. Of rituals involving pentagrams and ceremonial robes. One recurring legend speaks of members conducting black masses deep underground, where Christian symbols were inverted, and sacred rites twisted into grotesque parody. Visitors were supposedly encouraged to surrender themselves to vice. The caves became a hidden world where morality no longer applied, and the atmosphere matters, because locations absorb emotion, not literally perhaps, but psychologically. A place repeatedly associated with fear, secrecy, humiliation, and violence. The caves became synonymous with corruption, and eventually, the stories began changing. People no longer claimed strange things merely happened inside. They claimed the caves themselves became strange. Cold spots, disembodied voices, sudden illness, and feelings of panic. Some visitors described the sensation of being watched from deeper within the tunnels, where others reported hearing movement in supposedly empty chambers. One especially unsettling detail appears repeatedly in modern accounts. The feeling that the caves don't want you there. That sounds melodramatic until you hear enough people say it independently, and then starts feeling less like folklore, and becomes more of a pattern. Now, every haunted location eventually develops a central ghost story. At the Hellfire Caves, that figure is known as the White Lady. Descriptions vary. Some see a pale woman drifting through corridors. Others report a face emerging briefly from darkness. A few witnesses describe long black hair. Others insist she wears white robes. But the emotional reaction remains remarkably similar. People become overwhelmed with dread. Not surprise, curiosity, just dread. One visitor described seeing a female figure standing near the inner temple during a guided tour. He assumed she was another tourist, but when he turned back moments later, she'd vanished. No footsteps, no nearby exits, just gone. Another account comes from paranormal investigators exploring the caves after hours. During a period of silence, one member reportedly began crying uncontrollably. When asked what happened, she claimed she'd seen a woman standing at the end of the corridor. Watching. Not moving. Just watching. The group later reviewed audio recordings and captured what sounded like a faint female whisper. But stories like these continue, again and again. There are also darker versions of the White Lady legend. Some believe she was a woman involved in the club's activities who died within the caves. Others claim she represents someone sacrificed. But there is no historical evidence supporting these claims. But folklore really requires evidence, because it feeds on fear, and the caves provide endless fuel. Now, if the White Lady represents sorrow inside these caves, another figure represents something far more threatening: the man in black. Witnesses' descriptions are disturbingly consistent: tall, broad, dressed in dark clothing or robes, usually seen at the edge of corridors, almost always silent. One former employee described locking up the caves late at night. One former employee describes locking up the caves late in the evening when he noticed a figure standing motionless near the junction leading towards the inner temple. Assuming someone had remained behind after closing time, he approached. The figure then stepped back into the darkness. The employee followed, but the corridor was just empty. No sound, no movement, nowhere to hide. Another witness claimed to encounter the figure while walking through the caves during a Halloween event. At first they assumed it was just an actor, until they realised nobody else nearby seemed to notice him. The figure reportedly stared directly at them before disappearing into a side passage. The witness later asked staff which actor had been positioned there, and there was none. What makes stories like this linger is not the sight in itself, but it's the atmosphere surrounding it. The sensation people describe afterwards, like something ancient briefly acknowledged them, and then chose to retreat. The deepest point in the Hellfire Caves is known as the Inner Temple. Even the name sounds ceremonial, forbidden. It sits at the far end of the network beyond twisting tunnels and symbolic landmarks. Visitors often describe reaching it as strangely exhausting, not physically, but mentally and emotionally. The chamber itself contains a circular table and atmospheric lighting. This is reportedly where the Hellfire Club held most of its secret gatherings. And for many people, this is where the caves become genuinely frightening. Paranormal investigators frequently focus their attention here. Electronic voice phenomena, sudden temperature changes, equipment malfunctions and shadow sightings. There are countless stories. One investigator claimed his torch repeatedly failed only within the inner temple. The moment he stepped outside the chamber, it would work normally. Another described hearing heavy breathing behind him despite standing completely alone. Several visitors have reported sudden nausea. Others feel overwhelming panic. One particularly disturbing account involves a tourist who refused to enter the chamber entirely. According to friends, she froze at the entrance and began shaking. When was asked what was wrong, she simply said, "There's something in there." And later she claimed she could feel hatred radiating from the room. Now, skeptics would argue that expectation shapes experience, and they would be right. If you enter a location already primed by horror stories, your brain becomes hyper alert. Every shadow feels alive. Every sound becomes suspicious. But the caves create ideal conditions for fear. Darkness, claustrophobia, silence, and history and suggestion. Your imagination begins constructing monsters automatically, and perhaps that's the real haunting. Not ghosts, but the human mind itself. Or perhaps that is exactly what something underground wants you to believe. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Hellfire Caves haunting legend involves children, and specifically, children's voices, because they aren't already creepy enough. Several visitors have reported hearing faint laughter echoing through the tunnels. Others describe whispers, tiny footsteps, or the sound of a child humming somewhere deeper in the background. These accounts are difficult to verify. Caves distort sound naturally. Voices travel strangely, reflecting off the surfaces. But but certain reports remain difficult to dismiss entirely. One tour guide allegedly heard a young boy calling out while locking up for the night, believing a child had become separated from their family. The guide searched the tunnels, but there was nothing. No missing visitors. There was no one inside. Another paranormal team captured what sounded like a child giggling during a recording session. At the time, none of the investigators heard anything. Only later during playback. Now, children in ghost stories trigger a uniquely primal fear. Perhaps because the innocence corrupted feels fundamentally wrong. And the Hellfire Caves already possess a reputation for moral corruption. The combination becomes deeply unsettling. Whether these experiences are paranormal or psychological, they leave an impression, especially underground, in darkness, and when your torchlight barely reaches the next wall. Now, during the 1980s and 90s, stories surrounding the Hellfire Caves exploded once again. Britain, like much of the Western world, now entered the era commonly known the Satanic Panic. Rumours spread rapidly about hidden cults, secret rituals, occult crimes. Because of their infamous history, the Hellfire Caves became a magnet for speculation. Locals claimed strange gatherings took place there at night. Teenagers dared each other to enter after dark. Reports surfaced of candles and occult symbols appearing within the tunnels. Some stories were undoubtedly exaggerations. Others may have been simple vandalism, but the atmosphere intensified. The caves transformed from historical curiosity into something approaching more modern legend. Ghost hunting groups began investigating more aggressively, and television programs featured at the location. With every new retelling, the mythology grew darker. Problem with fear is that it accumulates. A story told once becomes folklore. Told 1,000 times it becomes identity. And today, many visitors arrive expecting terror. And that expectation is powerful. But occasionally, people experience something they cannot easily explain. Those are the stories that endure. Among the countless paranormal reports connected to the Hellfire Caves, one type appears more frequently than any other: shadow figures. Dark shapes glimpsed briefly at the edge of vision, human silhouettes standing silently in impossible places. One particular chilling account comes from a visitor exploring the caves during a quiet weekday tour. As the group moved between the chambers, he noticed someone standing alone far down one of the tunnels. The figure appeared completely unnaturally tall. Completely still. Assuming it was another tourist, he continued walking. But as the distance closed, something felt wrong. The figure remained perfectly motionless. No shifting, no breathing, nothing. The visitor stopped. And according to his account, the figure seemed to lean sideways unnaturally before vanishing into darkness. Not walking, vanishing. He later left the tour early. Years after, he refused to visit the caves. Now, scientifically speaking, peripheral vision is unreliable, especially in low light, because our brains will fill the gaps constantly. But the emotional intensity of these encounters fascinates me. People describe genuine terror, the sort that lingers physically, shaking hands, cold sweats, sleepless nights. Something about the caves creates encounters that feel personal, not like watching a horror film, more like being noticed. And then, of course, there is the man himself, Sir Francis Dashwood. According to legend, Dashwood never left the caves. Visitors and staff alike have reported seeing an older gentleman dressed in historical clothing wandering the tunnels. Some describe powdered wigs. Others report aristocratic clothing from the 18th century. One guide allegedly saw a figure seated alone at the inner temple table before the apparition faded. There are stories of phantom laughter echoing through the empty chambers, of wine-like smells appearing suddenly underground, Some believe Dashwood's obsession with the occult tethered him permanently to the caves. Others think the ghost stories merely emerged naturally from his reputation. But regardless of belief, his presence dominates this location. You cannot separate the caves from the man. He built them. He shaped their mythology. And perhaps in a strange way, he achieved exactly what he wanted. Immortality, not through politics or status, but fear. Now, I want you to imagine entering the Hellfire Caves after midnight. No guided tours, no crowd noise, no reassuring chatter, just darkness and cold air, and the sound of water dripping somewhere unseen. Paranormal investigators frequently describe the caves as emotionally draining. Even experienced teams report unease. One investigator recounted sitting alone near the inner temple during a vigil. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. And then he heard footsteps approaching slowly from the corridor, measured and heavy. The sound stopped directly behind him. He turned, and there was nothing. Moments later, those footsteps resumed, retreating into darkness. Another team claimed to capture and explain knocking sounds answering questions during an EVP session. Skeptics point toward acoustics, water movement, thermal expansion, all reasonable explanations. Yet the emotional effect remains powerful. Fear thrives underground because your sense becomes compromised. You cannot fully trust what you see or hear, and the caves exploit that beautifully, and some might say deliberately. Now here's something important. Not every haunting requires ghosts. The human brain evolved to detect threats in darkness. When visibility drops, imagination compensates. In caves especially, your senses begin misfiring. Shadows appear mobile, sounds distort, time feels strange. Claustrophobic environments trigger heightened adrenaline responses. Now add centuries of horror stories. Suddenly every creak feels sinister. Every flicker becomes supernatural. This does not make experiences meaningless. Quite the opposite. Psychological hauntings can feel every bit as real as paranormal ones. The terror is genuine, the panic is genuine, the memories remain genuine. And perhaps that explains why the Hellfire Caves endure. Not because everyone believes in ghosts, but because everyone understands fear. The caves weaponize imagination. They create the perfect stage for the mind to frighten itself. And once fear takes hold underground, it spreads extremely quickly. Today, thousands of people visit the Hellfire Caves every year. Some arrive as history enthusiasts, others seek paranormal thrills. Many leave with stories, a cold hand sensation, a sudden whisper, a figure glimpsed briefly in the distance. One particularly common report involves sudden emotional shifts. Visitors entering perfectly calm before becoming overwhelmed by anxiety deeper underground. Some will laugh nervously. Others will grow unusually quiet. Children occasionally refuse to continue walking. Mind you, that happens most of the time anyway. Whether supernatural or environmental, the effect is remarkably consistent. These caves unsettle people. And perhaps the most fascinating part of this is, the fear often begins before anything happens. The set-in alone does the work. Stone, darkness, history, silence. It's the perfect ingredients for a haunting. Among all the stories surrounding the Hellfire Caves, one theory disturbs me more than any ghost. What if the caves were designed specifically to alter human behaviour? Think about it. It's a symbolic descent, the darkness, the ritualistic layout, the deliberate isolation from daylight. Dashwood understood theatre. He understood psychology. and perhaps the caves functioned as a machine, a place engineered to dissolve inhibition, to amplify fear, and to encourage transformation. And if generations of people entered those tunnels expecting darkness, perhaps each visitor added something intangible to the atmosphere. Not supernatural energy, but emotional residue, centuries of fear, anticipation, and obsession. Human minds layering story upon story until the caves became a living myth, because myths shape reality, and the Hellfire Caves may be one of Britain's most successful myths, a place where expectation and darkness combine into something unforgettable. Nowadays, eventually, every visitor reaches the exit. You climb back towards daylight, the air changes, and birdsong returns. The world feels normal again. But many people describe carrying something out with them. Not a ghost, but a feeling. Like the caves remain somewhere in the back of their mind, waiting. Because underground spaces affect us differently. They remind us how fragile we are, and how quickly darkness can erase certainty. And perhaps that is why the Hellfire Caves continue haunting people centuries later, not because of demons or curses, but because deep beneath the hill lies a perfect collision of history, fear, and imagination. A place where human beings willingly descended into darkness, and left behind stories too disturbing to die. Some say if you stand alone in the inner temple long enough, you'll eventually hear the footsteps approaching from deeper within the caves. The unsettling part? There's no deeper tunnel. Now, thank you guys for listening to Your Local Haunt. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, please subscribe, like, comment, send it to everyone you can. And remember, if somewhere feels wrong, there's usually a good reason for it.